5 Azure cost mistakes we see in every audit. So, Azure cost optimization. It's something a lot of people ask about, and today we're going to walk through it step by step. Now, mistake number 1, no resource tagging strategy. The first thing we check in any Azure infrastructure assessment is tagging. 9 times out of 10, we find resources with no tags at all, or tags applied inconsistently by different teams at different times. The practical problem: without tags, you cannot allocate costs to departments, projects, or environments. Your finance team sees one Azure bill. Nobody can identify which workload caused the spike in compute costs last quarter. Every investigation becomes a manual search through the portal, and manual searches rarely find everything. According to Microsoft's Azure Cost Management Best Practices, consistent tagging is the foundational step for any cost governance program. Without it, every other optimization effort is guesswork. Next up, mistake number 2, oversized VMs are the most visible Azure cost optimization problem. Lift and shift to Azure is the fastest way to get off on-premises infrastructure. It's also the most expensive way to stay in the cloud if you stop there. When teams migrate workloads at 1:1 parity with on-premises server specs, they typically over-provision by 40 to 60% because on-premises servers are sized for peak load that rarely occurs. Azure cost optimization, done correctly, looks at utilization patterns across time, not just averages. A VM that peaks at 80% CPU during business hours but idles at 3% for 14 hours per day is a candidate for autoscaling, not a smaller fixed VM size. Azure Advisor surfaces the most obvious cases: VMs running under 5% CPU for 14 or more days. But it misses the subtler over-provisioning that autoscaling would fix better than downsizing. If your team is running Azure DevOps consulting services or CI/CD pipelines on dedicated build agents, those are often the worst offenders. Agents sitting idle between pipeline runs cost the same per hour as agents under full load. Now, moving on to mistake number 3, skipping reserved instances and savings plans. Pay-as-you-go pricing is convenient. It's also significantly more expensive than the alternatives for predictable workloads. Microsoft's reserved VM instances pricing page documents savings of up to 72% compared to pay-as-you-go rates on 3-year terms. Most organizations that engage Azure consulting services, particularly those using an Azure Managed Services Provider model, run a mix of predictable baseline workloads and variable spiky workloads. The baseline workloads are strong candidates for reservations. The variable ones are better served by savings plans, which offer flexibility as workload patterns shift. The mistake is applying the same pricing model to everything, either all pay-as-you-go or overcommitting to reservations for workloads that vary significantly month to month. Next up, moving on to mistake number 4, dev/test environments without Azure cost optimization controls. This is where the real money hides. Development and test environments running 24/7 are often responsible for 30 to 40% of an organization's Azure bill, particularly in software companies where each developer has their own cloud environment. The problem compounds quickly. Developers spin up environments for a sprint and don't tear them down. A feature branch environment from 4 months ago is still running a SQL instance, a Redis cache, and 2 app service plans. Nobody owns it because there are no tags. Nobody shuts it down because nobody wants to be responsible for deleting something still in use. This is a governance problem before it's a cost problem. In our Azure cost optimization work, organizations with 20 to 50 active developers typically run 2-3x the number of cloud resources they need at any given time. Now, moving on to mistake number 5, no Azure landing zone implementation. An Azure landing zone is a pre-configured, policy-enforced environment structure that defines how subscriptions, networking, identity, and governance are organized before workloads move in. The analogy that holds: it's building the foundation and plumbing before constructing the house rather than retrofitting infrastructure after the walls are up. Most organizations that migrate without proper Azure landing zone implementation end up with what Microsoft calls the big subscription pattern: everything in 1 or 2 subscriptions with no environment separation, no governance guardrails, and no cost attribution structure. This pattern makes every other mistake on this list significantly harder to fix. We covered the architecture in detail in Azure Landing Zones Explained for Midsize Companies. The core point: landing zones are the structural prerequisite for serious Azure cost optimization. Let's talk about how does an Azure architecture review surface these savings. An Azure architecture review is a structured assessment, typically completed in 1 to 2 weeks, that maps your current Azure environment against Microsoft's well-architected framework and your actual workload patterns. For cost specifically, a proper Azure infrastructure assessment covers. An Azure security assessment runs alongside the cost review. Cost and security are not separate work streams. Misconfigured networking, such as storage accounts left publicly accessible, creates both security risk and hidden egress costs. Fixing the security issue fixes the cost leak at the same time. Q Services is a Microsoft Azure consulting company that has consistently found 20 to 35% potential savings in the first assessment for organizations that have not done a formal review before. That figure comes from real engagements, not projections. Next up, moving on to what to do next: getting an Azure infrastructure assessment. If any of the 5 mistakes in this post sound familiar, a formal Azure infrastructure assessment is the fastest way to quantify the problem. The output is a prioritized finding list with estimated savings per item, so you can make an informed decision on implementation before committing to a full remediation engagement. If you are also considering a larger migration, starting with an assessment clears the path. Azure Cloud Migration Services work best when workloads land in a cost-governed environment rather than replicating existing problems in the cloud. Our breakdown of how much Azure Cloud Migration actually costs gives realistic numbers on migration engagement costs and timelines. For organizations evaluating partners, our 10-question guide to evaluating a Microsoft Azure consulting partner covers what to ask before signing anything, including how a partner handles scope changes, which is where most consulting engagements go wrong regardless of the technology. Let's talk about next up. Conclusion: Azure cost optimization requires consistent attention. Azure cost optimization is a continuous process, not a one-time project. The 5 mistakes covered here: missing tagging strategy, oversized VMs, wrong pricing models, ungoverned dev environments, and no landing zone foundation, compound over time. Each one makes the others harder to fix. Q Services is a Microsoft certified solutions partner specializing in Azure, and these findings come from real audits across healthcare, logistics, banking, and SaaS organizations. The 5 phases of Azure migration are assess, plan, migrate, optimize, and govern, and most cost problems originate from skipping or rushing the assess and govern phases. The good news: all 5 are fixable. Most organizations see meaningful savings within 90 days of starting a formal Azure cost optimization consulting engagement. The fastest path is a structured assessment that tells you exactly where to focus first. If you want to understand where your environment stands, our Azure Consulting Services team is a good starting point for that conversation.